The verses in the Quran are generally clear, and others require tafsir. Okay, and only those that are clear, only those that are unambiguous, can be used for deeming something halal or haram. Um, right? Because the Imam Abu Yusuf himself used to say, I used to see my teachers from the people of knowledge, يكرهون في الفتايا أن يقول هذا حلال وهذا حرام. My teachers themselves, because this is the fear that the ulama had, that it's not a light matter to make something halal or haram. That's a divine right. So the ulama were careful to make things halal or haram, because that's only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Except that's in the Quran, إلا ما كان في كتاب الله عز وجل بين بلا تفسير. That's something that's very clear in the Quran, then we don't need to go into it. So zina, drinking alcohol, all these things are clear in the Quran. Other things the ulama might say is makruh, and they develop categories like makruh tahrimi or makruh tanzimi. And this is really important because you find in our modern age, modern Muslims impacted by modernity, they're very quick to make things haram. And the ulama of the past, or even the Sahaba, they were very careful about doing this, because it's not my right or your right to make something haram, right? Unless it's absolutely clear. So they would be very, very conspicuous about making things haram. And in a modern age, we find this with certain overzealous Muslims that they do this. But if you read the Hanafi fuqaha, they are very careful. They are want to make something haram without explicit evidence from the Quran, because it's as though you're saying you know better than the Prophet or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we seek refuge from from that sort of mindset. So the Quran is very, very important. But the second set of guiding principles when it comes to sources of law is precedent. What does precedent mean? What has been said or done in the past. And there are two things here. One is the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, but also the opinions of the Sahaba, the Salaf, and the Fuqaha. So the Hanafis are actually very Salafi, if you like. They're very Salafi in the sense that they gave a lot of weighting to not only the Sunnah, but also the early generation. You'll see this time and time again, that they take the views of certain companions very, very seriously, or the early community very, very seriously, because they were practicing, they were living in the best of times, Khairul Qurun, and they were living in a time where people wouldn't need to lie, people wouldn't need to fabricate, and these people were practicing. So precedent is very important, because you have the Sunnah, which is important, but the Fuqaha were always looking at the Quran, with one eye on the Quran, the Sunnah, and the third eye, if you like, on how do people understand this hadith? How did the companions understand this hadith? How did they practice this hadith? How did the Salaf, how did the Fuqaha before us practice this hadith? And again, going back to my little whinge about modernity, what we do is we don't do that anymore. We just take a book of hadith like sunnah.com, or we go on Bukhari, or we go into Muslim, and we just kind of like extrapolate a hadith. We take a hadith out and apply it. And that's just disrespectful, because that's never been our way. Our way has been, well, what have people said before us? 14 centuries of scholarship. There's books written on every hadith in detail, commentary. What have ulama said about this hadith? How did they understand this hadith? Where did they get their understanding from? And so that's a labor of love. That's a way of doing intellectual work, and it requires real work, as opposed to people going onto Twitter and just copying and pasting a hadith and then giving their own tafsir. They may not even know that that hadith has been abrogated. No one acts on that hadith, because books of hadith, like I mentioned before, are just data sets, if you like. They're just snapshots or pictures, if you like, of what the Sahaba saw. But maybe that particular image or that particular hadith, if you like, is no longer applied today, because the Prophet ﷺ said something else later on in his life. If you're a scholar, you'll know that. If you're an alim, you've read the tradition, you'll know. Or you read something and there's some ambiguity in the word, you'll know how to make sense of it. So this is something for all of us to be aware of. And there's this intellectual humility that should be expected of us when we do this. So there's precedent, there's Quran, there's Sunnah, and the Salaf, and there's a textual preference. Imam Abu Yusuf is really focused Why am I saying all of this? Because we're seeing the 2nd to 4th century, these things are coming together. Imam Abu Yusuf is really pioneering and emphasizing the idea, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, that when you name, or when you mention hadith, you need to mention who you got it from. You need to tell us the reliability of that person. We need to know if we can trust that person. So he kind of moves in that direction. Before that, there wasn't that emphasis, because when someone said something, you accepted it, and you could always find proof for where they got it from. But now Imam Abu Yusuf, because of his training, as I mentioned, because of the scholars that he studied with, shifts the dialogue, conversation towards who did you get it from? So he would say, Amman, who did you get it from? Okay. So if it wasn't someone that we knew, or you don't mention who you got it from, then he said, we don't take it from these people. So you'll find many, many examples, especially in the book that I mentioned before, the book on Ar-Rad ala Siyar al-Awza'i. You'll find that takes place quite a lot. And even when he cites the position of Imam Abu Hanifa as his student, he clearly mentions who the authority for that person is. Imam Abu Hanifa might not mention it, but his student then traces it back for him. So this is the danger of just reading books without seeing how other people have understood their books as well. And this is a regular feature that you will see in the work of Imam Abu Yusuf when you read his text. So you have Quran, of course, you have precedent, Sunnah, Salaf, you have a textual orientation, which is two things, which is that the authority from whom you get your sources, you must name that person, and that person should be reliable. You can see there's a shift towards hadith understanding, and this is happening very early on, 2nd to 4th century, right? So this is something that I really emphasize with people, that if you don't read text carefully, you don't know that these books exist, then you will fall into a trap of projecting modern issues into the past. Saying, well, they never mentioned Sahih and Da'if. They didn't have these categories because they didn't need to do that at that moment in their time as well. Okay, so the Isnad becomes part of the Hanafi tradition. It's important. So he expresses that, for example, one place he mentions, فَإِنْ هَذَا لَيْسَ يَقْبَلُ إِلَّا عَنِ الرَّجُلِ الثِّقَاتِ. We won't accept this until you tell us, when he's debating with the scholars, he said, we won't accept this until you tell us from a scholar who's thiqa, who's well known. Okay? فَعَمَّنْ هَذَا الْحَدِيث. Where did you get this hadith from? وَعَمَّنْ ذَكَرَهُ وَشَهِدَهُ. Who mentioned it? Who witnessed it? Yeah? وَعَمَّنْ رَوَى. Where did he narrate this from? So Imam Abu Yusuf really focuses on this in his own methodology. And he provides his isnad, he provides his sanad. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. But when he doesn't mention the sanad, you can find it. You can find it in other books. So one should not be worried that he doesn't mention his sanad all the time. If he doesn't mention it, you'll find it in other books. And there are reasons why they may not need to mention the sanad, because it's well known, or he's mentioned it elsewhere. So you'll find this in them. So even though, I'll come back to this. Even though Imam Abu Yusuf mentions this idea of the trustworthiness of the people that you narrate the hadith from, he doesn't actually go into assessment of them. He doesn't criticize them, critique them like the Ahlul Hadith would do. And there's 2 points here I think I want to just emphasize. What he does is he wants to demand that people hold themselves up to high standard. He's holding himself up to high standard. He's saying, if you mention something, if you mention a hadith, you need to mention who you got it from, so then we can scrutinize it. Okay, and you'll see this in his books. And then he also makes it clear that if you have weak narrations, they should also be exposed, and we should be able to debate them as well. So you'll find this a lot in the works of Imam Abu Yusuf, rahimahullah ta'ala. Okay, so let's move on to the next discussion that I want to have, which is his juristic acumen, his sharpness in juristic abilities of Imam Abu Yusuf. And I think that's something that I want to bear in mind. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm just going to move on because I don't want to spend too much time on things that we can talk about later on. Okay, so let's move on to my notes. Right. Yeah. So just to recap, the method that Imam Abu Yusuf really brings together is Quran, and that's already been something that Hanafis are doing. Um, Deriving principles from the Quran, and this will become very, very important as you will see in a few moments. Deriving legal principles, ethical principles, rational principles from the Quran. So they're all rooted in the Quran. So their usul is rooted in the Quran. They look at the Salaf, which is the Sunnah, but also includes the Sahaba, includes the jurists before them. So they have a lot of respect and reliability on the ulama that came before them. Then there's the textual orientation, which is the idea that Imam Abu Yusuf is particularly keen to see that you name who you get your hadith from, and that that person that you name or that person that's in that transmission, we can trust them, and it must not go against the Quran. It does not contradict the Quran or the Sunnah, and it's not unknown of. It's something that you're just making up. Okay, so I want to just move on to this idea of right-based jurisprudence. And what we see is that all of these ideas are now coming together. So you have these ideas, the Quran, ideas from the Quran, legal reasoning that's taken from the Quran, hadith, sunnah, practice that's happened before. All of this is now being brought together. So the point I'm making here is that as moderns, when we think of Sharia or when we think of fiqh, we are obsessed with like only going to the hadith. We say we need a hadith for this. But what we really should be doing is looking at everything. When we have the hadith, when we're looking for the hadith, does this make sense in light of the Quran? Do we have a verse that kind of helps us to make sense of this particular practice? Do we have Salaf practicing this? Does it make sense in light of the broader considerations that we've derived from the Quran? Do we is there anything that goes against this? So the fuqaha, what they're doing is they've taken all these ideas that have developed over centuries and putting them all together and putting the whole thing together to make sense of the hadith. This is very, very important. This is one of the main issues that people have, because what they say is, oh, we need a hadith for this. If you don't have a hadith for it, there's no basis for this. Well, you don't have a hadith explicitly for everything, like I mentioned in one of the early lectures. But you can derive principles if you put the entire gamut, the entire tradition altogether, which is the Quran, not ayat only from the Quran, but also understandings from the Quran, legal principles from the Quran, practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Salaf, the Fuqaha, all of these things. If you put them together, then the Fuqaha are doing this. So this is what the law is really about. The law is knowing everything, or as much as you can, about the divine revelation and employing all of it together. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that it's brought, you bring as much evidence as you can into your particular views. And the Hanafis are they use right-based jurisprudence, right? Because they believe that the Sharia makes sense. Allah has given us a revelation, and that revelation inherently for the Hanafis is that it should make sense, or it ought to make sense. So that's something that I want to emphasize, and that's why I've written here: the law is indeed sensible. And so, if you read Imam Abu Yusuf's book, you'll see that when he attributes things to Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, it's based on this idea that he picked up in Kufa, that the law is sensible. It's not a haphazard collection of statements, right? So they don't just take hadith and just kind of like stitch them together, or they take ayats and stick them together. But what they do is they put all of this together. They take all the ayats, they take all the hadiths, they take all the reasonings that they can, they bring it all together. The practice of the people before them, they bring all of that together. This is when you know that a person is a real scholar, by the way. A real scholar will be able to not only give you the verse in the Quran, the hadith, but he will also tell you how it all fits together, right? That's the difference between someone who decides things and a person who's able to put it all together, link it all together. So this is part of a larger legal system, and this system should make sense. So for the Hanafi fuqaha, the divine revelation has to make sense, and it all fits together to make a harmonious whole. Okay, so the fuqaha are developing a system of rules which they can apply consistently, And that's beautiful, because you're being held to a standard, and you're holding yourself to a standard, rather than just picking hadith here and there, which modern people do today. Many modern Muslims do this. They just pick a hadith from here and there, and they don't have an idea of how it works, or worse, they just rely on translations. They don't know Arabic, they don't know the basics of the Sharia, and they're doing this as well. And so when you read, for example, one of the books that I mentioned, Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa wa Ibn Abi Layla, you'll see this. You see that Imam Abu Yusuf is trying really hard to find legal harmony. And so this is something that I wanted to point out. The Hanafi way, the ways of the fuqaha of the Hanafi mazhab, is always trying to reconcile, is always trying to be systematic. So what they do is they take reasoning abilities, and they take meanings that are found in the hadith and the Quran, and they know that this can be recognized by the mind. So what they do is they have the Quran and the Sunnah, textual sources, but they also have a reasoning ability that that we believe Allah has given to us, and they bring it both together. So it's not unthinking. You don't approach the Quran without thinking, right? Allah tells us in the Quran to think, to reflect. So they look at the verses in the Quran, they bring all the hadith, they bring entire tradition with them, but they also engage with it to use their reason. So it's not, it's not frivolous, it's not chaotic. It all comes together as well. And the way they do this is questioning, debating, reasoning, to find out what is the meaning behind all of this. When Allah tells us to do something, when the Prophet ﷺ tells us to do something, or we didn't do something, or we did something, what is the meaning behind it? What's the ma'na behind it? Okay, and then they formulate a legal system. And so whenever a new situation arises, they are using the Quran and Sunnah. This is what I tell people. They are using the Quran and Sunnah, because you won't find, like I told you right at the beginning, for many situations, you won't find a Quranic verse or a hadith that explicitly tells you about that new situation with modern technology and so forth. But if you derive strong legal meanings, ta'lilat, you know what the reason behind is, then you can apply it. So that is actually applying the Quran and Sunnah consistently. And this is the point I want to make. It's systematic and it's consistently applied. And so you'll find this in the Hanafi mazhab, Quran, Sunnah, precedent, opinions of the Salaf, and these sort of things as well. So how do they do this, my friends? Well, you have Quran, which gives you a rule. And then you look at that rule that Quran gives you, and then you see if you can apply it to new situations. And then that multiplies over time. So you have these rules that are can be traced back to the Quran. You have precedent of how the early community applied it, and you bring it all together. You have a new scenario, and you think, okay, we've got all these rules that we've taken from the Quran, we've extended them, we've understood why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do this, that, the other, and we can now confidently apply that to a new situation. We don't have a verse in the Quran directly about it, but it's connected to the Quran because we've derived principles. Okay, and so they were able to do this. They use qiyas, they use illah, try to find a legal reason behind it, and they try to find a meaning behind it. If you remember, in one of the first or second lectures, I talked about the example of breaking wudu. Right, I gave you a legal meaning, right, which is absolutely rooted in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So people often use this Ahlul Right as a slur, but actually, if you think about it, it's based on the Quran and Sunnah as well. And of course, like I mentioned earlier on, that there aren't many legal verses in the Quran, but you can derive ideas from the Quran around, for example, ada. That for us, from the Quran, we realize that something that's a habit of people, it's a good habit, then we recognize that. We take into consideration ethical and moral principles. Things should be easy for people, right? Allah mentions this in the Quran about taysir. We should do what's beneficial for people. You find this in the Quran. You have what's called umumul balwa, which is that if something is so important for you to know as a Muslim and your salvation depends on it, then it must be well known amongst the companions and all the Muslim generation. There can't be something that's only one person narrates the hadith, because everybody should know about it. It's obvious, because the Prophet ﷺ would have emphasized it, would have done it day in, day out. So we use these filters to make sense of all of this as well. For example, zarura, this idea that if you're in a real difficult circumstance, then there should be more flexibility in the Sharia. Sometimes we have haja, people are in need. So how do we deal with this? You have these ideas which are called ethical or moral principles in the Quran. And this is all part of the package. They're not standalone considerations, but they're all part of the package when you're looking at a situation, when you're trying to work out what is it that my creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wants for me. So the system of law is obviously excavated from the Quran and the Sunnah, and we have a system that allows us to make sure that we apply it to the degree that we are confident that we best applied it for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do. So all of these repertoires, all of these tools, the toolkits that Judas has to learn, helps him to do that. Otherwise, it's just opinion. Otherwise, it's just people just talking about it on Twitter with no understanding of the depth that's required here. So it's all based on the Quran and the Sunnah. And I want to really emphasize that. And the fuqaha are really obsessed with making sure things are consistent. That when you say that you need to wipe a quarter of the head, then the way you come to that conclusion must be consistent throughout other chapters of fiqh as well. So where you have quarters and these sort of things. So I don't have the time to go into it right now, but jurists will always try to be consistent. And people who don't do this, people who just pick up a hadith, or they'll easily get caught out, because in one place you consider, well, here you use this hadith and here you've got a different scenario, you use this. So what's your method? Oh, I don't have a method. I've just picked up the hadith book and I've just looked at the chapter of Tahara and I've just made this conclusion. Well, that's not good enough, right? That's an insult to the law. The law isn't to be mocked in that way. You can't just choose and select whatever you want. You have to have a consistent method. Show me a method, like my math teacher used to say to me in school, and it stuck with me. Show me your method. Show me how you came to the conclusion that you did, right? And so in some of my own writings, whatever I can, I try and do that with my own work as well. So there's coherence, there's consistency, there's systematic reasoning. I can see which verse you've used, why you used it, how you understood it. But if somebody brings another hadith, I can see how you've explained that hadith. I can see how it ties to broader moral and ethical principles. So I think that's also part of what Imam Abu Yusuf offered to the Ummah. There's a lot more to be said, and I'm just going to make sure I haven't missed out anything that's that's worth mentioning. There's quite a lot of detail that you might want to take home with you. Bi'iznillahi ta'ala. Let me have a quick look, and then we will, inshallah, end there. I hope that's been useful. Bi'iznillahi ta'ala. And I just quickly see if I've missed out anything that's might be worth mentioning here for you. Yeah, I've talked about him being a judge. I don't need to go into all of that. We could talk about the piety of Imam Yusuf, which you can read in the books. You can read about his quotes. But what I want to say is this: that Imam Abu Yusuf was a great scholar. His contribution is significant in statecraft, in judgeship, and he straddled that difficult line between being an imam and part of being as a governor and as a judge rather. And he took seriously learning of knowledge even until his death. On his deathbed, we have narrations that talk about he was still interested in giving laws and helping people doing fiqh. So if you're going to study something, study fiqh. Get a good teacher, learn Arabic really well, learn mantiq logic, and get into this field, because we do need people who can do this. Many of you, mashallah, do have the ability to do this, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. The final thing I will say is that after all is said and done, we are looking at scholars of the past. We can never do justice to their lives, but we can try and follow their methods, try and be open in the way we approach things, have humility in the way we do ilm, and have adab toward, because this is the way of the Hanafis. We have adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have an adab with the makhluk of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can debate things, we can argue about things, but you should never spill into abuse or insults. This is not the way of the Hanafis. Abu Hanifa, as you can see, encourage conversations, he encouraged debates, but you have to be qualified to do that. You have to be in a position to be able to do that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve you all. I don't think I'll be teaching next week. You'll have Mufti Saab teaching you. So if you have any questions, you can reach out. I've given you resources, and we'll stop there. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. So I'll do the easy part, Munis. I don't really have translations. I don't know if there's much been written in English on Imam Abu Yusuf. Um, so I can't really help you. I've been reading all the Arabic sources. Asad has asked a question about Ahlul Rai. Yeah, so it was used as a pejorative term, and I can see why people would say that. But given that we've had 1400 years, 1200 years of scholarship now, and people have understood how the Hanafi mazhab works, Ahlul Rai is not a negative pejorative term. And to be honest, everybody's using form of legal reasoning. Everybody's using a way of trying to understand revolution. So it was a pejorative term early on, but it's no longer seen in that way. Some people still use it today. So you'll find certain movements, especially coming from like the Middle East, they'll use it in a pejorative term. Um, but that probably is more symptomatic of their ignorance more than anything else. So he has asked, is there a good book? Is there a book that goes with this course? Um, you know what? That's a brilliant question. I don't know. My reading comes from papers, academic papers, comes from reading primary sources. Unfortunately, we don't have like a thorough academic um, overview of the Hanafi mazhab. Um, so you'll read individual papers or books. There are some that I can point you to, but we haven't got like a thorough book. And towards the end, lots of these books they become very, if they are written, they become very sectarian. Um, and the challenge is to remain academically rooted. That's my opinion, anyway, for what it's worth. So I can't help you there, Hira, I'm sorry. But this course helps, and there are other courses. The Hanafi Mazhab is very much misunderstood outside of most people, but it was part of the empire. It was normal. It was part of Sunnism. The Hanafi Mazhab is very much accepted. It's only last 100 years that it's been kind of like seen in the negative light, and there's lots of reasons for that. Tamam. If we don't have any questions, I think we'll end there. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Thank you to everyone for attending. I hope again, inshallah, you find this useful. It's been we go through it really, really quickly, but hopefully, inshallah, we can go into depth in future courses. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu alayk. Assalamu alaikum.